Well, good evening, everybody. As you can see on the screen, John Towle, Master of the Honourable Company of Air Pilots. Welcome to the TIMS webinar. On behalf of all air pilots, I'm delighted to welcome so many fellow masters, along with members and guests from affiliated units and other organisations. In these difficult times, we're not able to extend our usual air pilots hospitality, welcome at the RAF Club with conversation and a drink. But Zoom has opened up new opportunities, and we're delighted to, as the Clerk Paul was saying, that we've got members all around the world in Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, North America. So welcome to all you. And it's just great that we're also able to extend the invitations to so many younger people in the Air Cadet organisations, university air squadrons, and we're passionate about supporting youth in aviation, and it's great that you're with us this evening. I'm delighted to welcome and introduce our speaker, Dr. Michael Fopp. Many of you will know Michael from the livery, past master of the Honourable Company of Air Pilots. Michael is a son of a Battle of Britain Hurricane pilot, and he is a well-respected historian of the RAF. He's the past keeper of the Battle of Britain Museum and the longest serving Director General of the RAF Museum. So welcome, Michael. And your subject this evening, the Battle of Britain, after 80 years, is it still important? Well, when I read that, I thought, well, of course it's important, because, you know, as a youngster in the Air Cadet organisation myself, we were all over the Battle of Britain. It was just riveting to us. And September was a pilgrimage to Biggin Hill in my case. And again, I was privileged on Sunday to be at Westminster Abbey for the service of Thanksgiving and rededication to mark the 80th anniversary. So our nation does remember the Battle of Britain in many, many ways, but I think this is a riveting question. And really, Michael, you have control. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Master, and good evening, everybody. As the Master said, I'm the son of a Battle of Britain, and I'll be talking about him during my presentation. What I'm going to do, though, is to pose a number of scenarios and questions about why the Battle of Britain is still important and why we shouldn't forget it. And I'm presenting to you, normally, as the Master said, we would do it in a facility in central London, either the Royal Aeronautical Society or the Royal Air Force Club. You've got me in my study, I'm afraid, in Buckinghamshire in England on a wet and pretty cold evening. But I'm surrounded, at least, by the references that I may need, depending on the questions that you ask after the webinar. As you can see, I'm in my study. So welcome, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. I shall share my screen with you so that you can see the images I've collected. What I'm trying to do with this presentation, though, is to give some alternative scenarios of what might have happened had we not lost the Battle of Britain, had we not won the Battle of Britain, and had we given in, if you like, to the Germans in 1940. But then, of course, to concentrate on what the alternative scenarios might have been, to show you some using video and using audio to show you what times could have been like, and then to focus in on the individuals, because it is a story about individuals. And I think you'll enjoy hearing about one or two of the participants, because I was fortunate enough in my career in the Royal Air Force Museum to be of that generation, to actually meet and get to know a great number of them. So I have fond memories of a generation that now is sadly almost past. So let me get straight into it. And here we are. Sir Frederick Trim's memorial lecture, The Battle of Britain After 80 Years, Is It Still Important? Well, here's a little warning for you. Immediately I start. Let's get it working first, because it doesn't seem to want to. I'm going to immediately test your audio system on your, whatever your device you're using to watch this webinar. I don't want you to blow your ears out when I start to use audio. So I hope you've not got some earache now and that you've turned down or turned up so that you can hear the other parts of the audio. And this is partly what the story is about, the young people of the Battle of Britain. And this is a Polish squadron at Northolt in 1940, a lovely colorized picture, and I'll be showing quite a few of them. But let's first of all talk about where I'm coming from. As the master said, my father was not just one of the few, my dad was one of the few. He was an Australian Battle of Britain pilot. He came over from Australia in 1938 because the King was offering free flying. And he joined the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve. And by the time of the Battle of France in May 1940, when he went over there with his Hurricanes and number 17 Squadron, he was just coming up, or just past his 20th birthday. And the picture on the left there is him, age 20, photograph he had taken for his mum. You can see that war has been declared because he's been issued with a sidearm, which is around his waist. Let's just go back, and if I can try and zoom in on him, just so you get a better look. There we go. He's got himself a gun. So he's actually sent this photograph to his mother, very proudly, Sergeant Pilot in the Royal Air Force. The picture on the right is his flight of number 17 Squadron that was based in Essex. In August 1940, you can see the corn stooks in the field behind. All young men. Half of those young men did not survive the war. Out of those 6 young men that were with him in that flight, 3 of them were gone by the end of the war. They're all in their 20s. The chap in the shirt sleeves, second from the right, he was shot down 10 seconds after my father was shot down on the 3rd of September 1940, tried to land his aeroplane in a field in Essex and had to bail out at 100 feet and didn't survive. My dad isn't in that picture because often we think of the Battle of Britain as being this David and Goliath battle, where this tiny enemy, this tiny Allied force was against this huge German enemy, and nobody had time to do anything but fight. My dad was on leave when this picture was taken. He was on a 48-hour pass, but the aeroplane behind the men is the aeroplane that he crashed and was recovered about a year ago. September last year, it was dug up from a field in Essex by a whole bunch of enthusiasts, and it's going to eventually, bits of it are going to be presented in a museum in Essex. There he is at 85. He died in 2005, and there's a less formal photograph of his squadron mates on the same aeroplane, YBE, in 1940 in the summer. So one man and his aircraft, for me, is why I got interested in the Battle of Britain, because he, like the generation that he was part of, just didn't ever speak about it. I heard about him being I knew he was a pilot, obviously. I grew up in an RAF family on RAF stations, going to multiple schools until I was sent to boarding school, the Bluecoat School in Reading, and I know some of them are watching the webinar tonight. Well, chance it would have been a fine thing 60 years ago when I went there. But you grew up and you knew your father was a pilot, but he never talked about it. That whole generation didn't talk about it. My sister, who's a little older than me, asked, she'd been given a project for school. What did your father do during the war? And it was only then, when I was about 12, that I realized he'd been a Battle of Britain pilot. And I said to my mum, I was 12, I said, when I grow up, I want to be a pilot. She said, you can't do both. And this year, it's particularly important because the 80th anniversary and the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund did a survey earlier in the year. And they discovered that almost half of British people don't know what the Battle of Britain was. And here's the details. 67% of 18 to 20-year-olds were confused with other military events. Some thought it was part of World War I. Others thought it was a civil war between Scotland and England. You can imagine why, with all the stuff we've had from Scotland recently over COVID. Some thought it was the Viking invasion. Some even thought it was the 2019 general election, although it was only 3%. Of those who were aware of the battle, 46% didn't know when it took place, and 78% didn't know how long it lasted. Well, it took place from the 10th of July until the 31st of October 1940. So 2.5 months, a critical 2.5 months in not just British, but in world history. 25% of people don't know, of those people didn't know who the few were. Now for my generation and those that follow quite closely behind us, as the master said, we do because we learnt about it at school, but I'll talk about who the few were. Let's go back though and find out where we got to and how we got to the Battle of Britain. This word appeasement, it's been turned into a dirty word since the Second World War, but in actual fact, all it means is that you rather try and find a peaceful settlement than actually go to war. And you'll do everything that you can in order to achieve that. The difficulty that people had in dealing with Hitler's Nazi Party and Germany of the interwar period between the First World War and the Second World War, there was an awful lot of indicators as to what sort of regime you were dealing with. In 1925, when he published Mein Kampf, if you ever want to read a huge tome and try your hardest to get through it, it's probably one of the worst books ever published. It's the most difficult to get through, but right the way through it are dotted little bits that actually came to pass, that became true. And if anybody had read that in detail, perhaps if it hadn't been so boring, they might have done, and we might have been better warned. We also went through in the 1920s, the Depression, the Wall Street crash, and it became an opportunity for dictators like Hitler and Mussolini in Italy to take a story to the general public that they could make things much better for them. During periods between the First World War and the Second World War, the inflation rate got so bad that people, if they wanted to buy a loaf of bread in Germany, would have to take banknotes filling a pushchair or a pram or a cart full of banknotes just to buy a loaf of bread. It got extremely difficult to live. So these dictators, Mussolini and Hitler, got all powerful. They got democratically elected by their people, and then they started to flex their muscles. And the more they spent on their people to fulfill their political wishes, the more they needed to expand. They needed to take the resources, natural resources and finances of other regions and other countries. They also wanted to, or they had to appease, if you like, their own populations. So they started to incorporate regions into their countries. The Saar region incorporated into Germany in 1935, Italy and Ethiopia. Germany invaded the Rhineland in 1936. Germany assisted Franco in the Spanish Civil War just before the Second World War. And it got worse and worse. And the rest of the Western world looked on and tried to make accommodations with these two dictators, particularly with Hitler. And in Austria, in 1938, Hitler actually allowed his armies to go straight into the country and take it over on the grounds that the German-speaking population of Austria wanted to be ruled by Germany. The West did nothing. The Czechoslovakian situation in 1938, the Sudetenland, which is a part of what is now the Czech Republic, had a large population of ethnic Germans. So Hitler, in expanding what he wanted, which was what he called Lebensraum, room for living space, he annexed the Sudetenland. And our Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, went all the way to Munich in the autumn of 1938 to negotiate a settlement. And basically, we gave away, or the West gave away, a country to try and stop Hitler expanding, Czechoslovakia. In 1939, he and the Soviet Union entered into a non-aggression pact so that the Soviet Union would take part of Poland after the Germans had invaded it and would do nothing to stop them. And thus, on the 1st of September 1939, World War II started when Poland was invaded by the Germans. The French and the British had already set up a treaty and said to the Germans that if you go to war with Poland, we will be their ally and we will go to war with you. We waited 3 days, and on the 3rd of September 1939, the British public listened to the radio, or the wireless as it was called in those days, and heard our Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note, stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
So, for the second time in a generation, we were at war with Germany again. We called the first part of the Second World War from September 1939 the phony war, because nothing much happened. But in fact it did if you were in Finland, because the Winter War of 1939-1940, the Soviets invaded Finland. And the Soviets did so badly that Hitler thought that they were very weak. And his opinion of them was so low that it reinforced his wish, which he then did in 1941, which was to invade the Soviet Union. But it all sort of came to an end in the early part of 1940, when the Germans invaded Norway and Denmark. We tried to do something in Norway. The Brits tried to do something in Norway, but failed. Germany invaded the Low Countries and France in May 1940, in their Blitzkrieg, as they called it. And that was, if you like, the end of the road for Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. He had tried to stop a war throughout his premiership, and he had been opposed primarily by a member of his government, Winston Churchill. So as soon as the Low Countries and France were invaded in May 1940, it was obvious that Chamberlain could no longer be Prime Minister. And Churchill was called to the palace, Buckingham Palace, and the King asked him to form a government, which he did in May 1940. And of course, we then had the ignominy of one of the greatest retreats in British Army history from Dunkirk, when we brought back more than 300,000 Allied soldiers, British and French soldiers, using the little ships and the Royal Navy, with the Royal Air Force protecting them while they came across. And we then waited. We waited for what was going to happen next. And what was going to happen next was Churchill taking control.
I would say to the House, as I said to those who have joined the government, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might, with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be. But without victory there is no survival.
So Churchill was one of the great men that immediately became apparent to the British public. On the top left there, Keith Park; in the middle, Churchill; on the right, Dowding. Those three men were masters, if you like, of air power. Churchill had been involved in air power since the earliest days of aviation. Keith Park, a New Zealander, And Dowding had been in charge of research in the Royal Air Force before the Second World War, and they were in charge of defending Great Britain from the German Air Force. But Churchill was a great man in drawing people around him. So Henry Tizard, his chief scientific advisor, bottom left, man who invented octane ratings. When we think about putting petrol or diesel in our car and we think of the octane rating, Tizard was the person who first defined that. Beaverbrook was a newspaper baron, but also a businessman, a fine manager. And Watson Watt was a fine electrical engineer working for the post office, the General Post Office, on telephone technology, and of course was one of the prime movers in inventing radar. So Churchill immediately brings great men together, and had done, and the preparations prior to the Second World War had brought these characters into bear. But the Battle of Britain was more than just individuals and more than just the pilots that we're going to talk about, because this became a battle where everybody was involved. The Second World War, there wasn't a single person who didn't have more than one job. If you worked in an office during the day, you were a fire watcher at night. If you were a fire watcher at night, you then went to a factory again the next day. Most of the people that you see in these images are volunteers. Obviously the milk lady isn't, but I'm sure she was doing something else in the evening. The ARP warden, of course, any of you who've watched Dad's Army will know the ridicule of which ARP wardens are subjected to in Dad's Army, but they were absolutely crucial to the civil defense of the country. So we're not just talking about the few, the pilots of fighter command. We're talking about the many. We're talking about a society that relied on the telephone, not the internet. We're talking about a society that relied for communications not on television, but on the wireless, the radio, the telephone. So all the infrastructure that we now understand didn't exist in those days. So it was done, if you like, in an analog fashion. But the preparations that we'd made before the war brought a great deal of time for us. We designed two particular aircraft. The top left one is the Hurricane, the top right one is the Spitfire, and one in the middle is the Boulton-Paul Defiant, all built to the same specification. The other main aircraft missing from that series is the twin-engine Bristol Blenheim, but also there was a squadron of Whirlwinds up in Scotland, twin-engine fighter during the Battle of Britain. But the preparations of manufacturing those aeroplanes in good time, but more importantly than that, was the warning system that underpinned it. So on the right at the bottom, you have radar masts made of wood, 300 feet high, all the way down the coast, facing Europe. Very obvious to the Germans, to any enemy, but unfortunately they didn't work out what frequencies we were on, so they never managed to jam them, although they tried very hard. And on the left is an operations room, a sector operations room, where that analog information about what was happening in the air meant that we could send up those aeroplanes you see to counter any attacking force that came and tried to attack us. And the purpose of that was, if any country wanted to invade us across the English Channel, they would have to have air supremacy, because if they didn't, they would be attacked by our aircraft and they wouldn't manage to achieve a crossing. And the Germans knew that as well as we did when we invaded Europe in 1944, D-Day. So without having air superiority, there was no chance of an invasion. So the point that made it so important that we'd made preparations in advance was the fact that this equipment was all in place. The other thing that was terribly important was that we were underestimated by our enemy, and our enemy overestimated themselves. And it's always a bad thing if you overestimate what you can do and underestimate what your enemy can do. They also made a number of mistakes which helped us out. Hitler had stopped the advance on Dunkirk and allowed us to get over 300,000 troops back to this country. The head of the German Luftwaffe, who's in the middle photograph there, he gave Hitler an assurance, because of the intelligence he'd received, that the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was significantly more superior than the Royal Air Force. He had an intelligence report which told him that the Royal Air Force was poorly led. Most of the squadron commanders had very little fighting or flying experience. They left it to their junior officers. They weren't very well controlled, and so on and so on, and their aircraft were not as good as the German aircraft. Well, that's because the Germans had a culture of shooting the messenger. So what you tended to do if you were a subordinate in the German armed forces, you tended to tell your superiors what they wanted to hear, rather than what was actually the fact. And that wasn't necessarily a good thing. So their poor intelligence picture and the fact that they interfered. Both Hitler and Goering and others interfered with the tactics, the day-to-day running of the battle by their airmen throughout the battle. And that helped the Royal Air Force enormously. Churchill, who was a military man to his boots right the way through his career, he'd been a military man, he was very prone to interfere or to question his generals. And he did so many times during the Second World War. During the Battle of Britain, he never once went against Dowding or Park, particularly Dowding, who was the commander-in-chief of our defences. Part of the success was the adamant change of tactics that Hitler and Goering insisted on by their fighter pilots. They were so surprised by our ability to go up and meet them because of our early warning systems that the bomber crew's morale started to fail. So they took the fighter pilots of the German Air Force's advantages away by telling them to fly more closely to the bombers. And then when we bombed Berlin by mistake, they bombed London. Hitler was enraged when Berlin was bombed. So they started to change their tactics and bomb London. And that took the pressure off fighter command and made it able to replenish itself more quickly. And also Hitler's ally, who joined him when he thought that the battle was going well in June 1940, he thought that he could take part in this and be part of the glorious victory against the Brits. His ambitions in North Africa ended up with Hitler having to divert significant numbers of his troops to help out the Italian army when it was defeated so roundly by the British 8th Army in North Africa. So mistakes by the enemy, preparations by us, all contributed to the Battle of Britain's success. And the result, the Battle of Britain, if you like, if you say it was won, that's true. But what we really did was we delayed the Germans' ability to invade until the weather was so bad that it became impossible for them to do so. So we remained the only bastion of resistance in Europe. And strangely enough, Hitler kept on thinking that we would join him in his quest to destroy the Soviet Union and communism. He believed, probably till his dying day, that he had more in common with the British than he did with the Slavs and the Soviets. So as a result of that, we became the only resistance site in Europe. We also resisted them in North Africa, which stopped them getting access to oil fields in the Middle East. We resisted them in Greece by helping the Greeks and the Balkans, and that delayed their invasion of the Soviet Union by about 6 weeks, which meant that when Hitler did eventually invade the Soviet Union, he got caught by the weather, just like Napoleon had before him 100 or so years before. We also, with the USA, supplied the Soviet Union with crucial material and support. They still won't acknowledge it, but the Soviet Union ran on Ford trucks, General Motors and Ford trucks. Mind you, so did the Germans. They took over the Ford factories, and would you believe, after the war, the Ford Motor Company tried to get reparations from the German government for the losses that they'd received when their factories were taken over. But General Motors basically built factories in the USSR to build trucks. we actually then acted as a launch point for the eventual invasion of Western Europe, which then led with the pincer movement of the Soviet Union coming in from the east and the Western allies coming in from the south and the west to the defeat of Nazi Germany. Now, if the battle had been lost, what sort of world would we have lived in? If we had come to some sort of accommodation with Hitler, not necessarily being invaded, but we may well have done some sort of deal with him and become a vassal state of the Greater German Reich. If the whole of Europe had been overrun and Hitler was obsessed with conquering the East, with Japan's belligerence in China, the Germans' technological and scientific prowess, and at that time particularly, the United States' unpreparedness and isolationist policies, they too didn't want to go to war. Who would? And of course, the spectre of the atomic weapons. Let's just look at let me just see if I can magnify this map for you to see where we got to when we were alone. There we see how big the German Reich got in 1941-42, moving in towards the Soviet Union. And all those pale and dark blue bits are parts of the Greater German Reich. They're all occupied territories. And the Germans had the technology and they had the ability to develop nuclear weapons. If, for example, they had managed to take the Belgian territories by going into Africa and taking the Belgian Congo, as it was called, it's now the Democratic Republic of Congo, if they had taken that, they would have had a massive resource of uranium to build atomic bombs. That's where the American atomic bomb supplies of uranium came from. So by stopping them, we had managed to stop the expansion, but more than that, we'd managed to stop what might have happened had the battle actually been lost. The American bomber project was a Messerschmitt 264, which was capable of carrying a weapon all the way to the east coast of the United States. It only got built in prototype form, but who knows what would have happened if it had been built and they had developed those sorts of weapons. Well, plenty of people have postulated what might have happened, and it's been done in books and films, and it's worth looking at. The alternative narrative. Here is a still Times Square in New York City. So let's look for a moment about what the world may have been like if we had either made an accommodation, as had all the other countries in Europe with Adolf Hitler, or worse, we'd actually been invaded by the country having lost air supremacy in the Battle of Britain. World War II had Britain made peace. Well, the green ones there are what actually happened, and the white ones that go on are what could have happened in a sort of sequence that had been postulated by various novelists, historians, as the sort of framework that could have happened around the world. And it all ends up in some of the narratives with the world being partitioned between Germany and Japan. Now just think about that for a moment. Two societies that valued human life in terms of slavery, numbers, and possession. I've put Prime Minister Sir Oswald Mosley there just as a candidate, as most of the occupied countries that the Germans occupied, they put a puppet government in place with a head of state that suited themselves. The obvious candidate in this country at that time was Sir Oswald Mosley. He was not knighted, he was an inherited baronet. That's how he got the Sir in front of his name. He'd been a Conservative MP, a Labour MP. He was an aristocratic figure. He'd been done military service in the First World War, but he had formed the British Union of Fascists. So he had the same thought processes and the same aims, if you like, as did Adolf Hitler, and would have been an ally of Adolf Hitler had he managed to conquer this country. So I've postulated that he might have been the candidate chosen for Prime Minister. What would German occupation of Great Britain have looked like? Well, it's very difficult for us to imagine. And there have been a number of films that have been made, and you may well have seen some of them. There's one on the TV at the moment, but this one is special. And anybody who is particularly interested, I would tell you that the DVD has been remastered, well, the film has been remastered, and it's been put on DVD by the British Film Institute. And the number of the film is on the slide there. This is a black and white film made, or actually made, between the late 50s and the middle 1960s by two teenagers, Kevin Brownlow and Andrew Mollo. Kevin Brownlow, distinguished film director and producer now, but was in his middle teens, 15, 16 years old when he started this project, on his pocket money as a budget. And he wanted to look and make a film, 16mm film, of what the German occupation of Great Britain would look like. I'm going to show you 2 minutes and 50 seconds clip of the film. And what it shows you is a lady from the countryside in occupied Britain coming to London to take up a job with the British Fascist Party, because she's been conscripted, and trying to get through London after not realizing what had happened, and then seeing what the occupation of Britain was going to be like.
The German invasion of England took place in July 1940 after the British retreat from Dunkirk. Strongly resisted at first, the German army took many months to restore order. But the resistance movement, lacking outside support, was finally crushed. For 3 years, it lay dormant. Collaboration increased as the population became adjusted to the tedium of occupation.
This evacuation is a temporary measure caused by Potsdam's competition.
Don't tell me that was a good burning down the barn just because some Germans have camped there. They're criminals, I tell you. Could you tell me where I could get a bus to Hendon, please?
Sorry, madam, there is no transport today due to the evacuation. I should hoof it. You'll have to walk in that direction and ask again.
Oh, thank you very much.
As I said, rather frightening, really. The film is an excellent one, and if you want to see more, then I recommend it. But there are a number of books as well. Here's just a selection. And The Man in the High Castle, the one on the top right, is currently being broadcast, a film version of it. They all show what might have happened had Hitler and Mussolini and Tojo in Japan rule the world. And it is not a scenario that any of us could possibly understand. And the movies as well. Here's just 4 of them. The Plot Against America and The Man in the High Castle is currently being shown, and you can see them. SSGB was on a few years ago, but you can still get that as well. And as I say, It Happened Here is well worth watching because it's the most accurate. Bollo was a fanatic on uniforms and clothing. And in the late 50s and early 60s, not only did he find the correct uniforms, but he also found the people who'd worn them living in the UK. And he also found the British Union of Fascists still alive and well and willing to talk about their feelings and why they thought that Hitler was right. So it's worth watching for that reason alone. But this is a speculation of what the world would have looked like if the Germans had got their greater German Reich. And basically it shows the world cut up as partly Japan and partly partly Germany. And I'll just highlight the colors so you can see. The dark red is the greater German Reich, the pink is the German occupied, and the Italy are the greens. And then the Empire of Japan are the sort of green and so on. So you can see that they would have occupied almost the whole world, and the whole world would have been under their control.
Suddenly, its sinews sprang into action. The Second World War began.
I'm going to leave that because time is shorter now, and I want to talk more about the people. That was, in fact, a newsreel from the film It Happened Here, a pseudo newsreel of what the Germans would have said if they had been trying to get over the population of Britain to understand what they had done in their propagandist way. But the reality, of course, of winning the Battle of Britain, keeping Britain separate, not occupied, a bastion for 7 governments in exile, 5 governments that brought with them their treasuries, manpower, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, Poland. Poland was the only country that never ever surrendered of the occupied countries. They never surrendered or did any accommodation with the Germans. And the 7th government in exile was one person, Charles de Gaulle. He came and of course set up a government which wasn't really recognized because they had the Vichy government in France. But Great Britain became an island for the exiled democratic governments of the whole of Europe because of the victory in 1940. And we became the springboard for the invasion in 1944. And the lovely photograph of the VE Day celebrations in London on May the 8th, 1945 on the left, and the very, very famous photograph of the VJ Day in New York, August the 14th, 1945, of the sailor kissing the nurse. And they now believe they found both those people, and she said she didn't really want to be kissed. The official VJ Day in America is actually September the 2nd, but this was a celebration on the actual day. So why? Well, the Battle of Britain was Hitler's first defeat. It was unique in a number of ways. It was the first battle that was fought solely in the air between air forces. It was the first battle in history that was named before it started. It was the first battle that was declared won before it was over. And it was the first battle that was viewed from the ground by the population that it was defending. Quite extraordinary. And a scene like this with vapor trails over London was what people would look out on virtually every day during, well, except the occasional day when the weather wasn't so good, throughout the 2.5 months of the battle. So it was Hitler's first defeat. It was important. The few, I mentioned at the beginning, and I mentioned too, and you mustn't forget this, how important the many were. My father and all the Battle of Britain veterans that I met would always talk about what everybody else did not what they did, particularly their ground crews. The picture on the right shows armourers rearming a Hurricane. The picture on the left shows Pilot Officer Keith Gilman of 32 Squadron. That was a publicity shot taken as a recruitment poster during that period, 1940. He was aged 19 and he went missing over the Channel on the 25th of August, 1940. He was one of 2,927 young men with an average age of 23 from 15 different countries. 544, the number changes now and then, but 544 lost their lives between the 10th of July and the 31st of October. But by the end of the war, because they didn't just fight in 1940, my father was very badly burnt and shot down in September 1940 in a Hurricane. He was back on operations a year later on Spitfires, and he survived the war. But 791 had died during the course of their duties by the end of August 1945. So let's remember these 20-something-year-olds and look at a few of them. This is 19 Squadron at Foulmere, the satellite airfield of Duxford in Cambridge, where the Imperial War Museum has such a fantastic collection. On the top left there, and these of course were black and white photographs. It was against King's regulations for a Royal Air Force person, or anybody actually, to carry a personal camera and take photographs themselves. So these are nearly all official photographs taken by skilled photographers with glass plate negatives. So their resolution is fantastic. And with modern computerization and some very skilled people around, they've been colorized. And my concern over the many years that I've been involved in the subject of World War II particularly, but the Battle of Britain especially, is that for many it's seen as so long ago because it was black and white. So in this presentation, I've pulled together a number of photographs that have been colorized to show what these young men look like in a more modern context. Flying Officer Len Haynes was awarded the DFC, the Distinguished Flying Cross, in October 1940. And like so many others, when he'd finished combat in the Battle of Britain, he got posted as an instructor. The Royal Air Force wanted to capitalize on the experience of these young men who'd been through the Battle of Britain and to pass that experience on to new recruits. So they were made instructors. Well, instructing is almost as dangerous as combat. And a huge number of people died in training command in World War II in the Royal Air Force. And Len Haynes was one of those. He was instructing out of Heston in a Miles Master, a trainer, two-seat trainer, and they crashed, and he's buried in Hounslow, and he crashed in April 1941. Bottom right there, Flight Sergeant Grumpy Unwin. Not really discovered. Anybody can tell me, I'd be very pleased why he was called Grumpy, because he rose to the rank of Wing Commander in the post-war, and he got the DSO in Malaya, but he had the Distinguished Flying Medal, which was the equivalent of the Distinguished Flying Cross, but for sergeants and warrant officers, for non-commissioned officers, which you see him as here. He got the Distinguished Flying Medal no less than twice. So he had it with a bar, and then he got the DSO in Malaya and survived the war and became a wing commander and retired from the Royal Air Force in 1961. I talked about the many and the debrief and rearming. This is the Spitfire Squadron in the Battle of Britain, and under the wing on the left you can see the armourers working on the guns. Behind the gentleman on the left looks like an intelligence officer talking to the two pilots. You can see the engine fitter in his overalls working on the aircraft, airframe fitter inside the cockpit wearing his shorts, and the what we would call avionics now, the radio wireless fitter working on the radio inside the fuselage. The two pilots are doing what fighter pilots always do. They're talking about the last combat they had by moving their arms around. But look at what they're wearing. We think of people flying modern combat aircraft, flying in flying suits and all sorts of stuff. In the Battle of Britain, they flew in their best uniform. Their collars were starched, and they had a stud at the front and a stud at the back, and the collar was removable, but many squadron commanders would not allow them to remove their collar and studs. So this pilot that's facing you is wearing his tie, his collar, his studs. He's wearing his life preserver, which is called a Mae West, because Mae West was an actress with a very large bosom. So the name was given to the life preserver for that reason. But look at the life preserver. It's sort of crinkly to look at, and it's bright yellow. That's because the pilots in 1940, during the Battle of Britain, were issued with a life preserver that was actually sea green, a sort of khaki brown sea green. So if they, and many of them did, were unfortunate enough to come down in the English Channel, they couldn't be seen. No British fighter pilots in 1940 had dinghies or any other survival equipment or first aid kits. The only thing they had was this Mae West. So they painted it yellow with yellow paint, the same yellow paint you see around the roundel on the side of the aeroplane. There was plenty of that paint about because the yellow roundel was put on those aeroplanes at the beginning of the battle to make them more identifiable to each other. So those Mae Wests have been damaged. And there are cases that I've seen over the years in my researches of pilots actually being castigated for painting their Mae Wests and damaging government property. Here's a very famous photograph of 610 Squadron at Hawkinge. It was taken on the 29th of July 1940 between missions. These pilots could fly up to 5 missions a day, something between 30 and 50 minutes a mission. They'd climb from ground to 20,000 feet, maybe a little higher if they could. And as you can see, there's a sort of 50-50 split on this photograph of sergeant, NCO pilots and officers. But once again, they're all wearing their best uniform and they've all got their ties on. Now, a fighter pilot spends most of his time in the air looking behind him, constantly looking to make sure he's not being attacked from behind. And many of them used to get very sore necks from these collars. So as the battle progressed, you'll see photographs of them wearing less restrictive clothing. And here's a very famous shot of Douglas Bader wearing a scarf and also wearing a flying suit. This is the flying suit he wore before he lost both his legs in a flying accident when he was in the Royal Air Force aerobatic team at the Hendon Air Displays in the 1930s. They all wore a flying suit because they flew open cockpit biplanes. He's with Eric Ball on the left and William McKnight on the right. Eric Ball got the DFC in October and went to the Western Desert. He was force landed, taken prisoner, and he was killed in a flying accident in 1946, age 27. William McKnight, of course, was a Canadian, and he received the DFC and the bar. That's 2 DFCs, Distinguished Flying Crosses. On the 12th of January 1941, he crossed the French coast to strafe enemy troops and railways and whatever he could find, targets of opportunity, and vanished, age 23. They're standing in front of Douglas Bader's famous Hurricane of 242 Squadron. You can see the 242 in paint, the top of the boot that's kicking Adolf Hitler up the backside. Very famous photograph, which has been colorized. Number 1 Squadron at Tangmere, winter of 1941. This is after the battle, but James McLachlan was a Battle of Britain pilot. I show him here because he was an ace and he only had one arm, as you can see, which is why he's putting 2 fingers up to Hitler's, because he's got 2 fingers on his other hand. And he was in 73 and 145 Squadron in the Battle of Britain. He awarded the DFC in July 1940. He actually led 6 Hurricane fighters, the aircraft behind him, off HMS Argus, an aircraft carrier of the Royal Navy, to help and reinforce Malta in November 1941. He got a bar to his DFC in February 1941, and he was injured in combat with a Messerschmitt 109 and had that left arm of his amputated below the elbow. On a daylight sortie in a Mustang, another fantastic RAF fighter, American-built RAF fighter of World War II, with a good friend of my father's and mine, with Geoffrey Page in July 1943, he was shot down and he died of his injuries in July 1943. Two very famous men, the 92 Squadron, Biggin Hill, see how young they are. And again, they've painted their May West, but they're in shirt sleeves and they're going to fly up to 20,000 feet. Shows you how hot that summer of 1940 was. Most of them remember it for the glorious weather. Brian Kinkham on the left, commanding officer of 92 Squadron, and his wingman is on the right, young Geoffrey Wellham. Next to a Spitfire, probably Willem's Spitfire, at Biggin Hill, June, July 1941. Kinkham got the Distinguished Service Order, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and he also served in Malta and was an ace. He was invalided out of the RAF as a group captain in 1954, and I knew him well. Wellham, of course, was awarded the DFC, and he also led 8 Spitfires off an aircraft carrier, HMS Furious, to Lucca in Malta, and he retired from the Royal Air Force in 1961. And he wrote the book High Flight, which is probably the best account of the Battle of Britain written by any of the participants. 85 Squadron, North Weald, September 1940. Here on the left is Peter Townsend and members of number 85 Squadron, and second from the left is John Paddy Hemingway. And there's a larger and later photograph of John Hemingway. John is the last surviving member of the few. He lives in a care home in Dublin, and he was 101 in July this year. He is the last one of the few left. And why are they called the few? At the end of the Battle of Britain, Winston Churchill gave a speech in which he said, "Never in the field of human conflict has ever been owed by so many to so few." After he'd finished it, a number of pilots of number 56 Squadron had been standing listening to the wireless in the mess at Biggin Hill. And one turned to the other and said he was probably talking about our mess bills. So what are we going to do about the Battle of Britain? My question, are we forgetting about it? Should we remember it? Well, luckily we have memorials. The top left is Capel Le Fern. The Battle of Britain bunker, 11 group operations room in Uxbridge is open to the public. Bentley Priory is now a museum where it was the headquarters of Fighter Command. We have statues to Dowding outside St Clement Danes, the one second from the left, and to Keith Park, Carlton Gardens. And there is the magnificent Battle of Britain memorial on the Victoria Embankment, which if you've never seen it, it's really quite special. And it has the names, as does Capel Le Fern. And we also have museums. All these museums have exhibits. I've included the Royal Observer Corps Museum at Newhaven Fort because the Royal Observer Corps were as much a part of the Battle of Britain, as I've said, the many. Of course, the Royal Air Force Museum, my museum that I was there for 30, 40 years, has no longer got a Battle of Britain museum as it had for so many years. It now has a relatively small exhibition, but all of Battle of Britain aircraft of the period. So these museums are carrying on the message. So I'm hoping that what we will remember in the future will be more than the survey that the Battle of Britain, the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund published this year. So what will we remember? Well, the past, with people like those young men surrounding the squadron commander of 85 Squadron, Peter Townsend, who sadly is now more famous for his relationship with the late Princess Margaret than with his fantastic leadership of 85 Squadron. He's standing there, by the way, with a stick because a few days before he'd been shot down by a Messerschmitt 109 and had to have his big toe amputated. but he went back to his squadron as soon as they would let him out of the hospital, and used a stick for about 2 or 3 months, but still carried on flying. And the future is above with the F-35, the Royal Air Force's latest fighter, and all the young people and boys and girls who fly in the Royal Air Force today. So what will we remember? I hope that we remember the people. The fact that you can have as much equipment as you like, you can have as much preparation as you like, you can do whatever you like, but what you can't do is inspire the people to have character, virtue, loyalty, and nationhood. And you have to do it in a democratic way. So the thing to remember is that the young men of the few of 1940 were no different than the young men of 2020. If we had the same situation again, I'm sure we'd be as well endowed with brave young people as we were when we defeated the Germans in the Second World War. This last photograph appeals to me, lest we forget, refers to Capel Fern's Battle of Britain Memorial. It was set up by Geoffrey Page, the man I mentioned, a good friend of my father's, and it's near Folkestone. It's well worth a visit, and like many museums and other arts institutions at the moment, it's really struggling for money. And the last thing that should happen is that we should forget these places, particularly during this, the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain. Thank you very much.
Michael, thank you so much. Really, really interesting insights. We've had some questions preloaded. I'm not sure if David Bolton, the master farmer, is there ready. David, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Master.
David, would you like to pose your question to Michael, please?
I'm a little overcome by the opportunity to raise a question, but I think I was interested to hear Michael's view about the critical feature of this event.
What is the critical feature?
Yes.
Well,
if I could just chip in, I think what David was also saying, was it the pilots, was it the planes, was it the radar? What was the most significant contribution to winning the battle?
Thank you, Master. It was the feature. Is it the planes, the people, or the radar?
No, it was a combination of everything coming together at a particular point in time when it was absolutely necessary that it did, and was helped enormously by failures on the part of the enemy, which is right throughout military history that has been a factor. But it's very difficult to separate the pilots, the aeroplanes, and the equipment that supported them. There is no question that what was called the Dowding system, the system of control, meant that we could disperse our people, put them up in the air only when they were necessary. The fact that they were flying Spitfires and Hurricanes, which had been well planned and well built and were every bit a match for their enemy, was a major factor. The fact they were flown by enthusiastic, well-trained young men was obviously a contributory factor, but so were the German aircraft, so were the Italian aeroplanes of our enemies. Let's not forget that airmen flying fighter aircraft are the cream of their generation, whichever country they come from. So it was a fact that the fact is that there was no magic bullet. It was a combination of factors that led to a victory, and a necessary victory.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Michael. Sorry. I've got a question here from Harry Martin of the Air Training Corps, which I'll read out for him. Where does the presenter stand on the importance of winning the Battle of Britain, i.e., could the Navy have prevented an invasion alone?
I doubt it. The Navy, of course, the Royal Navy at that time and the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, recognized this, were massive, and they had large numbers of ships compared to the Germans. But the Channel is not a good fighting place for capital ships. And the Germans were extremely effective in attacking ships. They'd had quite a long period of time before the Battle of Britain started in earnest, attacking our convoys going through the Straits of Dover with their Stukas, their Ju-87s. And again, later in the war, the invasion of Crete, the Germans showed that they could attack ships very, very, not easily, but they could sink ships quite prolifically. And of course, the Japanese did exactly the same with the Prince of Wales and the Repulse following the fall of Singapore. So the answer, could the Navy have stopped an invasion on its own? No, not without air superiority. I don't think it could. And I think any person in the Royal Navy would be asking for air superiority before they committed any capital ships into a narrow piece of water like the English Channel.
Thank you, Michael. And Will Wright, can you hear us? Can you speak well?
Hi, John. Yes, I can.
Would you like to pose your question, please, or would you like me to put it for you?
You pose it for me, but there is actually an additional question that I have after the first one that I pre-submitted. That would be great.
Okay, thank you. So to what extent are we using technology to enhance the memory of the event and to engage with a new and younger audience is kind of the first part of it, Michael. And sub-question, do you think the use of technology will remove the human element in the ability to tell the story or ensure that every detail is covered accurately?
Well, during my museum career, we as museum curators were constantly looking for new ways of interpreting the collections that we were presenting to the public. And I know that my successors are doing exactly the same now. Virtual reality will very shortly be, well, it is already into museums. And those things will, I hope, enhance the experience. And they'll certainly be more familiar to the younger generation than they are to the older generation. But that doesn't mean that more traditional methods shouldn't be used. And it also doesn't mean that you can substitute the real object for a replica or a makeup object. The ability also to interact with the veterans has almost gone, as I said in my talk. So there are only my generation who knew them very well, or those who've read a lot about them. And that means that research has got to continue and people have got to have their interest retained. And hopefully the use of new technologies like we're using tonight can ensure that that happens. But I feel very privileged, and I can't emphasize this enough, that I'm getting on a bit now, but that means that I was around to know the people who could tell me exactly what happened. So some of the things that are in my head, unless I get them over before I'm gone, will be lost if they're not recorded. So most memorials or museums have gathered archive information either verbally or in writing or through interviews or whatever to try and capture what was said by those that were there at the time. But let's not forget, it's quite a strange thing. Those that were there at the time don't necessarily know exactly what was going on. It's the person who comes along afterwards and does the research and gets the whole picture who tends to understand the strategy and why the tactics were used. The person actually carrying out the tactics only knew what he was told by his squadron commander or his group commander or whatever. So there's a mixture, but the technologies will certainly be with us and they will help. The supplementary, Will?
Michael, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. It's in fact, the second part of the question was something that I already had in mind again from what you've just said. So I really appreciate that. I suppose my next question is, we've seen a few individuals who have kind of had limb amputations and that sort of thing. Obviously, in this day and age, our flying world normally doesn't allow us to fly with those sorts of ailties. So to what extent did they impact on the battle, and was their ability to fly impaired as we now currently would think it is as a result of not being able to fly with those things?
Well, first of all, nowadays with Flying for the Disabled, the wonderful charity organisation, you can fly with much more serious disabilities than were capable of being used during Second World War. But the fact that the aeroplanes of the Second World War were pretty analog, it meant that you could have them adapted to fly with one arm, and there were more than just the pilot that I showed you with one arm. There were bomber pilots with one arm. There were ATA pilots with one eye. Douglas Bader, if you take Douglas Bader as, if you like, the archetypal example, he was probably the most ferocious, fearless fighter pilot, one of the most ferocious and fearless fighter pilots we had. And the reason he survived was because he had 2 amputated legs, and he left one behind in the aeroplane when he couldn't get out. Had it been his own leg, he would have gone down with his aeroplane. So I think what we have to think about is not what limitations we can put on disabilities and flying, but how we can make flying fit those disabilities.
Michael, I think that's such a powerful message, and I think that's something the company, can work on in the future. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a fab lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question, Will.
Thank you, Will. I've got a message here from Past Master Rick Peacock Edwards. A comment is, Michael, brilliant. Rick has a comment and a question, please, Rick.
Thank you, Master. Well, as myself a past master and also the son of a Battle of Britain pilot, as Michael knows well, I've got one comment and one question. My comment is, and I know, and I'm passionate about the Battle of Britain myself, and I know all the areas and the places that are sort of there at the moment that people have got to see. My comment is that, in my view, sort of anybody who has a British passport should be tasked at some point in their life to go down to Capel-le-Fern, to go down there and see the memorial, and to go and view the scramble experience, because it is just so sort of special, as Geoffrey Wellham, I know, would have told you from the past. But when I hear that 40% of the population don't understand the Battle of Britain, then something has to be done, and that's just one sort of example. Now, that's the comment. The question is, and quite frankly, had we lost the Battle of Britain, Michael and I would not be here now. So my question is to Michael, what do you think would have happened to the Battle of Britain pilots had the invasion been successful?
Wow, Rick, that's a good question. It's not one I've actually thought of before. You know that there was, of course, the Germans had a list, and for example, we as past masters of a livery company would have been dealt with pretty severely. Freemasons, Jews, the list was extensive. But the idea of what they might have done with fighter pilots, probably the same as they did with the fighter pilots in the other countries they occupied. If those pilots, I mean, most of the Polish pilots and Czech pilots got it out and came to us. The French pilots, they went into a sort of retirement. The Dutch pilots got out, the Norwegian pilots, when they could, got out. So I don't think they would have, I don't think there's evidence that they would have treated them any differently than, for example, an infantryman or a sailor. They would have tried to recruit them, I have no doubt of that, into the Luftwaffe. And who knows how many may have said, I'd rather keep flying than go into a prisoner of war camp for a bit and then be released and be required to take out forced labor or whatever, which is what happened in France. So the answer to your question is, I don't think they would have been on a hit list. I think that they would have either been used or go through the POW system.
Might they have been forced?
How can you possibly force a fighter pilot? I mean, fighter pilots need to be motivated by more than force.
I'm with you there. It's an interesting question.
Yeah.
George Blundell Pound, I think you're on also now. You have a question, yes?
Yes, indeed. A fantastic presentation, incidentally. I'm in awe of your the skills that sat behind that, the videos, the speeches and so on. So round of applause from Dorking in Surrey. The question was, I sense that Hitler's enthusiasm might have been wavering. He kept on believing, didn't he, that, you know, we would appease, I suppose, to use your phrase. How much do you really think he thought that the Battle of Britain would be won by Göring?
I think that Göring, he was quite loyal to his senior minions, the strange people like Himmler and Göring and Speer, extraordinarily compared to, say, Stalin, who used to have whatever general he didn't like that week shot and put up against a wall or put on the end of a cannon and blown to pieces. So Hitler in that context was quite loyal. And of course, people were telling him what he wanted to hear. And he still, I think, believed until quite, well, far into his defeat that he still had more in common with the Brits than he did the Soviets. And that surely at some point we would get the message that communism was worse than allowing Stalin to take over the world, you know, east of the Urals. And it was only really Roosevelt who trusted Stalin. Churchill didn't, and Hitler didn't. So I think Hitler still held out some hope. And of course, towards the end of the war, people like Himmler, and to a lesser extent Göring, were trying to come through back doors, through Italy, through representations to Italy, to make some sort of accommodation with the Brits.
Thank you. And I've got a question I'll read out from Michael Braden. Michael, I've opened your mic if you want to come back for comments, but the question is, Big Wing, your thoughts, please. Would you agree that Park was man of the match?
Oh, well, so Mike, the only time I ever heard my old man get really, really angry when he used to occasionally talk about the Battle of Britain was when they came back to Debden after they'd taken off, I think in early August, a 300 attacking formation of German aircraft coming over the Thames estuary. And it was just one flight for six of them. And when they got back to Debden, it was being bombed and there were craters all over the runway. And it was because Douglas Bader had been sent from 12 Group at Duxford to protect Debden and had been so long in getting the big wing up that Debden was very severely bombed. What I really can't understand, and you, Sir Mike, as a ex-chief of the air staff can probably tell me, how the heck does a squadron leader get all the way to the C&C and argue a point in the middle of a life or death battle?
Good question. Lee Mallory would be my answer. And, you know, I think he was rather impressed with Douglas Bader, who you will have met and I've met and a number of people on this evening will have met. A fantastic character. And as you rightly point out, a brilliant fighter pilot, but a man, a bull in a china shop on occasion, there's no question. And I think his influence on Lee Mallory and people in 12 Group was totally unreasonable, frankly. And if I may say, thank you very much for a terrific presentation. Thank you very much for the nice things you said about Capel the Fern. It is absolutely a wonderful place. I really would endorse everybody to go and see it. And thank you to Keith Park, who to my mind was the man of the match. And I think it took a long time for people to recognize that. He was not treated at all well. Not only did Lee Mallory, I think, screw up the opportunities that 12 Group would have had to have joined the fight at the right time and have made a great difference to 11 Group. But secondly, the treatment of Dowding and Park at the end of the war, at the end of the Battle of Britain was appalling. And I hope that sort of thing would never, ever happen again.
Agree, absolutely. Absolutely agree.
Paul, do you want to go?
Dr. Christopher Eaton, have a question? Thank you.
Yes, I'm the Master of the Worshipful Company of Makers of Playing Cards, and a retired naval doctor. There are 2 points I would like to make, and one is the RAF was so short of pilots that actually they were augmented by pilots from the Royal Navy, the Fleet Air Arm, including Sailor Milan, who was one of the aces, I think, who's South African, and of course Captain Winkle Brown, who died only a few years ago. The other thing is that in order to keep the Battle of Britain alive in our memories, I produced a very special double pack of playing cards to commemorate the Battle of Britain. It is a tradition that the master of the Worshipful Company of Makers of Playing Cards produces a special double presentation pack every year to be presented to the company and to our special guests. And mine celebrated the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain and showed all the key components that you've mentioned this evening most ably. I've enjoyed your talk immensely. If anybody would be interested in obtaining some of these special packs, because of the COVID crisis, I haven't attended as many events as I would normally do and been able to present them to special people like your master. If they would like to contact our clerk, I have a small surplus that people might be interested in purchasing. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Christopher. You're absolutely right. I should have mentioned that the Fleet Air Arm provided a number of about 30 pilots to Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain. I very proudly used to exhibit in the Battle of Britain Museum at Hendon the armoured windscreen from the front of a Spitfire from Sub-Lieutenant Cork Fleet Air Arms aircraft. A cannon shell came in through behind his head, took half of his ear off and exploded on the inside of his armoured windshield. So when he landed, his airframe fitter just unbolted the armoured windscreen, put a bandage on his head and put the armoured windscreen back on, and he carried on flying on the next sortie. So yes, the Fleet Air Arm pilots of the Battle of Britain are of course, a part of the few.
And Terry Holloway, you have the next question.
Hello, Michael. Thank you for a delightful talk. Having helped Sir Arthur Marshall deliver a Timms lecture a long time ago, I followed the Timms with huge interest, but this is the first time I've been able to listen to it whilst eating my supper on my knee. However, the question is this. The first questioner talked about the 3 critical factors for the Battle of Britain, and I wonder if I could introduce a 4th, which is the preparations which were conducted in 1937 and 1938 under Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister. Chamberlain is rather dismissed as being ineffective and an appeaser. He was critically ill. He died soon after the Battle of Britain started, but it was he who reinforced the Royal Air Force, was very enthusiastic to expand it, did a great deal pre-war. I wonder if you might make a few comments about Chamberlain's contribution to the Battle of Britain.
You're absolutely right, of course. And before him, Stanley Baldwin, somebody, a Labour politician who had said was restricting spending, was quietly funding defence spending before Chamberlain as well. I have a high regard for Neville Chamberlain. He was a politician of his day. He had been in the First World War. He did not want another war. What he did do with his Munich Agreement in October 1938, he really annoyed Adolf Hitler. Hitler was really upset, spoke very, very badly of Neville Chamberlain, because he got out of him that piece of paper that he waved, which was a signature to say they wouldn't go to war with us. But what he managed to do was he got us 12 months of time during which we put all those preparations that he knew about, because, as you say, Terry, had been fundamental with Churchill as well, of course, fundamental in making sure they were funded into place. So he knew how far behind we were in 38 and how far ahead we would be a mere year later. If we'd gone to war in 1938, we would have gone to war with fabric and wood biplanes, not Spitfires and Hurricanes. But I agree, Neville Chamberlain was a great statesman.
Thank you, Michael. My view too, entirely.
Yep, thank you, Terry. And sorry, Michael, do you want to go back there?
Yeah, a lovely statue of Neville Chamberlain, of course, in his constituency to this day, and he's still, you know, a major figure in that part of the world.
Thank you. And we've got a call coming in here from Hong Kong. Assistant Patrick Voigt would like to ask a question, please.
Master, good evening or good morning from our side of the world. Very nice to see you all, and thank you. Outstanding presentation. We took the opportunity of joining a couple of us together, so I've got Upper Freeman, Brendan Roscoe, who has also enjoyed the presentation immensely. Thank you very much indeed. The question that came up just literally as we were watching one of the videos of the skies above London is, where were the German aircraft, the Messerschmitts, etc.? Where were they based? Were they literally on the coastal, the French coastline, facing us at whatever bases they had there?
Absolutely, Pat. Thank you for staying up, Pat. By the way, especially when you were told, especially when you were told at the beginning it was being recorded, so you could really go to bed and watch it tomorrow. The Luftwaffe moved into French Air Force bases, and of course the aircraft of the period operated from grass. So we operated from grass and they operated from grass. So they could basically move into a farmer's field. The Messerschmitt 109 had a range that none of their aircraft were strategic. They were all meant for blitzkrieg. They were meant to support ground troops. So the Messerschmitt 109, their single-seat fighter, the match for the Hurricane and the Spitfire, could spend 10 minutes only over London, and then they had to go home. And they had more than their share of aircraft running out of fuel when they're on the way over the channel and coming down in the channel, which is why they had a fantastic air-sea rescue system when we had none. Most of our air-sea rescue was done by fishing boats in the RNLI until after the battle. So yes, places like Abbeville, all the way Calais, they had bases, which of course meant that we could see them on our radar as soon as they took off, because the radar on the south coast around Dover and Folkestone looked straight in to as far as their airfields, and they could see them there.
Indeed. So presumably we were trying to suck them across the channel to have a go at them, and then they would run out of fuel and either not make it back or, you know, et cetera, et cetera.
Not actually. They were trying to suck us to come up, because they had no idea of how sophisticated the early warning system was that had been developed by Dowding and Park with Watson Watt's radar and the control rooms. So they had no idea. So they just couldn't understand why every time they came, they would come up and they wanted the Royal Air Force to come up and then destroy it. And then when they only sent a few aeroplanes up, nobody came up. They couldn't understand this. So they started to send larger formations, and then they started to bomb airfields and so on, and we had to respond. So it was more in the beginning them coming and saying, come on, Royal Air Force, we want to destroy you, but not realizing that we had this extremely effective and sophisticated early warning system, which meant we didn't have to have standing patrols up all the time. We could put airplanes up and send them to exactly where they were needed, and we could see the enemy coming from exactly where it took off from.
Okay.
And how far behind were their radar there?
Thank you, Pat.
Brendan is asking, sorry, just very quickly, how far behind our radar development were the Germans?
The German, when the Graf Spee was sunk in December 1939 at the Battle of the River Plate, we sent intelligence agents out to the wreck because its radar was clearly visible. The Germans developed radar at about the same time that we did. We developed it on a totally different frequency. They knew what it was. They sent Zeppelin up and down the coast, our eastern coast, to determine what it was, because you could see these masts, to determine what the frequencies were so that they could work out how effective it was and perhaps jam it. Trouble was they couldn't. They thought we were transmitting and receiving on the same frequencies they were. And they mistook the frequencies we were actually using for spikes in our national grid, the pylons, because it was just tick, tick, tick was the only noise they heard, and they dismissed it.
Okay.
So they never knew exactly what our radar was capable of, but their radar development was about the same stage as ours. In 1939, the summer of 39, before the war broke out, they sent a delegation headed by Ernst Udet, senior man in the Luftwaffe, to talk to the Royal Air Force. And he, standing in the mess, having a drink with a group of Royal Air Force officers, he said, "How's your radar?" Well, they didn't call it radar, but how is your radio detection equipment coming along? Ours is doing very well. And everybody was very shocked because it was a big secret. So theirs was about the same as ours. He was also shown, by the way, at the same visit, that the people the most secret thing that he got close to was a reflector gun sight on a Spitfire. And it had been covered up by a pilot's helmet. And everybody had been told not to show it to him. And he said, "What's that?" And they lifted the helmet. And he took one look at it, and it was so obvious what it was that he went back and had a word with the German Revy company, and they copied it within about a month.
That sounds familiar. Anyway, Past Master Flop, thank you so much, Master. Thank you very much. I'll go back to mute if that's okay, if I can work out how to.
Oh, don't worry, Pat. We'll do that for you. Michael, there's lots of comments coming in, lots of very, very appreciative comments about the presentation, and several people are asking, and this is probably one Paul could answer, how will people be able to come back and show us and share this presentation with, for example, Air Training Corps, squadrons or similar? Could you help with that, Paul, please?
Yeah, well, as I said at the beginning, this will be recorded, and I have a list of, I will email out to all participants tomorrow or Friday, a link where you can download this from the Zoom site. We also hope to actually put this onto YouTube in due course, so next week. So it will be publicly available. Yeah.
Can I just also respond, Master? When you see it as a recording, on the last slide is my website address. And on that, if you go onto the website, michaelfocktalks.com, there's a contact button. So if you have any questions, I'd be only too pleased to try and answer them for you.
Thank you. And I've got a question here from Vincent Waits of the 1075 Squadron Air Training Corps. Vincent, can you hear me? Would you like to pose your question to Michael, please? Okay, yeah. I'll go with it anyway. It's what does the presenter think it would be interesting for the documents in relation to Rudolf Hess's flight to Scotland if they're declassified? What do you think might be in the documents, I think is the question.
Probably that they discovered he was a psychopath, mentally unstable, sycophantic to his boss, a very good pilot, and had a very, very strange perception of what was going on in the world.
Okay, thank you. And we've got, I think, Past Master Chris Ford is there on the line. Chris, do you want to ask a question?
No, thank you. I raised my hand by mistake because it was a finger error there. But Michael, that was the most fascinating discussion and talk about the Battle of Britain. There was a tear welling up in my eye quite a few times, and I think that it's just sad that the younger generation don't appreciate quite so much what the middle generation have lived through because their fathers haven't spoken about anything. My father was a transport pilot, and it wasn't until a couple of years before he died that he even admitted anything that he'd done, even in a transport aeroplane in that war. It's moving, it's great, and thank you very, very much for your time.
Chris, he must have been very proud of you after what you've done.
Sadly, he didn't live to see me being the master of our livery company, Michael, which sort of upset me.
Thank you, Chris. I noticed, Will, you are back on, but you, as we've had you before, just before we come to you, there is a question from Garth Manger as well. Garth, would you like to go and speak that to Michael?
Yes, thank you very much, Master. Thank you, Michael. Thank you. I really enjoyed that. My question, I think you've answered a little bit already when you talked about Big Wing, but I was interested in the tension between Fighter Command and Bomber Command, and whether the Battle of Britain did anything to redress that balance. I'd also like to just say that my grandfather, I think, was also in 17 Squadron, although he was killed in the battle.
No, you're absolutely right. He was in 17 Squadron on a flight with my father. So I know the name well, and I know quite a lot about your granddad. So if you need any more information, then just let me know. Bomber Command and Fighter Command. No, there's talk of a sort of conflict between the two. More people were lost in Bomber Command during the period of the Battle of Britain than were lost in Fighter Command, because you mustn't forget that whilst Fighter Command was defending the country from the Luftwaffe coming to bomb us, Bomber Command was having a go at the barges that were being assembled in the French ports, Belgian, French, Dutch ports that were preparing to invade us. So they had a job to do every night. They had already suffered huge losses prior to the Battle of Britain. So most Fighter Command pilots particularly were just very pleased that they were flying fighters and not bombers.
Thank you.
Will, very quickly, do you want to come in again? Will, right?
Needs to unmute.
Yeah.
I'll press on. We've had a copy Morrissey from Corporal Morrissey from 1312 Squadron Air Training Corps. Really good question. How do you think, as young people, we can educate and interest our friends about the Battle of Britain? Should schools have a mandatory section in its history teachings, a special bank holiday? And also, thank you for your time, sir.
Well, Poppy, over the years, it's been suggested quite a few times. We have a Trafalgar Square, we have a Waterloo station, we have Waterloo streets, beginning with Waterloo all over the place, and Trafalgar, but there is nothing, if you like, for the Royal Air Force. So that's one of the things that has been suggested, and possibly why the memorial was built on the Victoria Embankment in London a few years ago. But how do we, and particularly you, Poppy, your generation, make sure? You can't mandate it. You've got to deal with it as the people that were involved with exactly the same sort of people as we are now. They were 20 years old, 25 years old. They were given huge responsibility. They were very enthusiastic. They were fit. They were well educated. They had worked hard at school, and all the things that you, I know, will be doing in the Air Training Corps, they were doing as well. And they can become role models even though they're not around anymore. And the way that we make them role models is to talk about them more often, and to perhaps pick one or two and find a little bit more out about that person, and then tell our friends. And that way we can keep the memory alive and keep the idea alive. I hope that answers your question, Poppy.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. That's really good, Poppy. Thank you. We've got a question coming in here, Michael. I think it's Bhavesh Chown. Good evening. Do you have more details on Flight Sergeant John Hanna, VC? And he's interested in the pre and post career with the Royal Air Force.
Yes, but I'd ask you to go onto the website and I will give you chapter and verse. I think he was the youngest Victoria Cross, if I remember rightly. But yes, there's a huge amount of information about him, and I'd be only too happy to share it with you.
Okay, thank you, Michael.
We have another one coming, G. Bode. He has a specific question about the clocks in the ops room. G, would you like to unmute yourself? Perhaps you're having a bit of problem with that. Michael, I'll read out the question. G has, the clocks in the ops room had coloured triangles, some pointing inward and some outward. what do the colours and direction of the triangles represent?
Right, now I really need to stand inside an operations room with you to explain this, but I'll try and do it as quickly and as easy as I can. Let's remember that these aeroplanes are approaching each other, the formations from either side, the Germans and later the Italians as well, coming towards the Royal Air Force at a closing speed of more than 500 miles an hour. So everything is happening very, very quickly. And in front of the commanders is a big table with the area of their operations shown on the table. And around the table are primarily young women with headphones on and a microphone, and they're receiving the information that's coming from the radar stations and the observer corps, because once the aircraft got over the coast, the observer corps used to track them all through telephones, and they'll be receiving information like 300 Heinkel 111s, overhead so-and-so, 15,000 feet, direction northeast, whatever. The pilots can then be directed, but they can only be directed from the information that comes through the headphones of the ladies around the table. And they move like with croupier sticks, little wooden blocks with the number of the raid and a flag above it with the number of aircraft and the height. And the clock, it has a color. On the little block on the table, it has a color. And that color is one of two of the three colors on the clock. And only two of the colors are visible. And the minute hand is the hand the commander is looking at. He's not looking at the hour hand. He's only interested in the latest report. And those clock little V's of color, the closer you were to the English coast and the Germans, if you're in Kent, they were 2-minute gaps. The further north you were, they went up to 3 or 4 minute gaps. So each report came in, the lady that was working the marker would move it to its new position and put the latest color on the clock. So the commander would then look up at the clock, see that the clock hand was on red, and he'd look down for the red marks and where they were. And then he'd give instructions to the fighter aircraft in the air where the formation was moving at that particular moment. So those colors represent minutes and how immediate the latest report is. If it was yellow, it was before red, so it's more than 2 minutes old. So he's waiting for the next color to come up. That's how it worked. I hope that explains it. But it sounds complicated, but trust me, when you get in the operations room, it all works. And that's how they got airplanes to where they needed to be. Because often the Luftwaffe would send a force in and then they would do a feint. They would dash off in an opposite direction. And at 250, 300 miles an hour, they can travel a long distance in a couple of minutes. So they needed to have exactly where they were. And that's why the color coding on the clock was so important.
Thank you. And Michael, here's a good one from Paul McHugh. For young people today, would you recommend the 1969 film Battle of Britain?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was the last time that they could get that level of aircraft together and also shoot it without green screen, without computer generated graphics. So all the flying that you see in that film is real. A lot of the pilots were Spanish Air Force because the Spanish Air Force was flying the German aircraft of World War II still. They're built under license. So yes, the only thing that I get slightly annoyed about is the love interest. But Susanna York, I think it is, she's a lovely lady, or was. So yes, 1969 Battle of Britain film, watch it. But the other one you should watch as well is Michael Caine, who appears in the film as a squadron commander, made a film about making the film afterwards, and he narrated it. And the film about making it is almost as interesting as the film itself.
Okay, but the questions are queuing up here, Mike. So we'll move on to perhaps to Rick Davies next, please. Rick.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning at 13 minutes to 5 on a Brisbane morning.
So is the sun up yet?
No, it's just starting to get light outside.
Right.
My interest in the Battle of Britain was actually promoted. I was on an instructor posting with an Air Force Flying School, number 1 FTS at Point Cook, and I was asked to take Hamish Mahadi, Group Captain, retired, flying, which I did. And I was aware that he'd been the technical director for the film, The Battle of Britain, and I guess that promoted my interest. So I have two questions, if I may. There is a view expressed that the Luftwaffe made a classic error in tying the fighter force to the bombers, and that had some outcome which was detrimental to what Hitler and his directive had made. Would you care to comment on A, did it happen, and B, was it deleterious to the strategic aim?
Yes, I mentioned it in the presentation. It gave the Luftwaffe fighter pilots a huge disadvantage, and it was a direct order from their Commander-in-Chief Goering, because he had the squadron commanders of the bomber squadrons constantly contacting him and saying how they couldn't do anything about being attacked by Hurricanes and Spitfires. Although, just as an aside, most Luftwaffe pilots were always shot down or shot at by Spitfires. They very rarely were shot at by Hurricanes when you read their accounts. But in fact, as you probably know, 3 out of 5 aircraft in the Battle of Britain were actually shot down by Hurricanes of all forms of defense. But the mistake was made, and he went to the Luftwaffe commanders, squadron commanders, group commanders, and said, you must get closer to the bombers. And that took away all their advantages of height. So they were flying around amongst the bombers, and then when the Spitfires and Hurricanes attacked them, they had no advantage of speed and height. So they got very, very angry. And Goering actually came to see Mulders and Galland, I think it was at Abbeville in France, on his big train, and it was depicted in the film. And he castigated them, he called them cowards. The famous quote was that he asked them what he could do for them at the end of his quarrel, and Galland said, yeah, I'd like a squadron of Spitfires, please.
Yes, I was fortunate enough as a student when I was on pilot's course to actually listen to a presentation in Melbourne by Adolf Galland, and he was asked that question about the friction with Goring. He was fairly approximate, I guess, in his answer, but the aftertaste was that Goring had no understanding of the difficulty of fighting the tactical battle in an aircraft with a very short range. Can I ask one sub-question? I have the book here, Battle Over Britain by Francis Mason, published in 1969. Does that have your approval as a one-stop reference on Battle of Britain?
Yes, absolutely. Francis Mason's book was, the first one was a book called The Narrow Margin, and then Francis Mason's Battle Over Britain. Obviously, an awful lot more information has become available since that book was written. But if you want to know everything you need to know about the Battle of Britain, there's no better book than Battle Over Britain.
Thank you very much for your answer, and thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. It's not every day that a transport pilot gets up at 3 o'clock in the morning. So thank you and well done.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Rick. I've got going back to Chamberlain from Keenan Carr. Had Neville Chamberlain continued as Prime Minister, do you believe that the Battle of Britain would still have been won?
I think Neville Chamberlain's position after Dunkirk was such that he could not continue as Prime Minister. As Terry Holloway said when he spoke a few minutes ago, he was ill, he had cancer, had a brain tumor. He knew his limitations, and he knew that either he or Lord Halifax, his Foreign Secretary, would become the new leader of the Conservative Party and then be invited to form a government. It was though Halifax declined, and Churchill said yes. So I think there was never a question that Chamberlain would have been a Prime Minister leading a Battle of Britain.
Thank you. Paul McHugh, you're next. Would you like to unmute yourself? Paul? Okay. Michael, we have one quick question. We haven't had any ladies, any female questions yet tonight, but I have one now from Dominique Kubavec. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Dominique. We'd like to ask a question.
We had Poppy.
Oh, yes, we have. Sorry, yeah. The question with Dominique is that they're obviously having trouble unmuting themselves. Were there any women fighter pilots?
Dom, no, there weren't any women fighter pilots at that time. The aircraft, though, that the fighter pilots flew, and many of them commented on the fact that they would go to bed at night and their squadron would have, I don't know, 70% of its aircraft rather than 100%. And then the next day, suddenly it'd have 100% again. And that was because we had a thing called the Air Transport Auxiliary, which was civilian pilots, predominantly men, but also women. And they delivered aircraft to operational units. And there were a significant number of women by the end of the war. And just as an aside, they were the first group of women in the UK to get awarded equal pay with the men that they were serving alongside during the war. And the Air Transport Auxiliary women, we had a number of them as members of our livery company. And they were really something else. So there were no fighter pilots. There were no combat pilots in the Royal Air Force or the United States Air Force, Army Air Force. There were, of course, in the Soviet Air Force, but not in the German Air Force. They didn't have pilots flying in combat, but they had one or two extremely seriously effective test pilots in the German Air Force. So women were not in combat in the Second World War, except in the Soviet Union.
Thank you, Michael. That was really an exceptional talk. We thoroughly enjoyed it, and it was really touching to hear about. Thank you.
Thank you, Dom.
I know, Paul McHugh, you've now unmuted yourself, so would you like to pose your question?
Thank you. Just to say thank you to Michael, but just following up on the issue of the Battle of Britain film, which was my question, which was answered earlier. I would agree that it is a film that can bridge generations. I remember it inspired my interest in the Battle of Britain, and you mentioned Susanna York, and she bridged the generation between my father and myself because we both appreciated her. I think she was the first member of the opposite sex who we both appreciated, my father and I. But I would like to see that film reappear on television more because, like you, I think it is inspirational, and I think it probably would still hold valid for our air cadets and young people of today.
It is broadcast pretty regularly, and also, of course, Reach for the Sky, Douglas Bader's story, appears regularly, but primarily for us old folk in the afternoons.
Thank you.
Alongside all the adverts for funeral plans and stuff like that.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we are actually keeping Michael very late away from his dinner. It's coming up to 8 o'clock. I've just got, Poppy Morrissey has got another question. If you'd like to pose that one, Poppy.
Can you hear me, sir?
We can. We can.
First of all, thank you for talking to us today. So honestly, it's been amazing listening to you. My question is, how do you feel, how proud do you feel to know that your father was part of you?
Obviously, Poppy, if your parents have done anything of note, children tend to be proud of them, especially when you only find out almost by accident. So that's a reason why you should ask them and your grandparents what they did and listen to them when they tell you, and you might be surprised at what you find these old people have actually done in their lives, as I was when I was your age.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Bye.
I think that's a fantastic point. People are reluctant to talk about things they've done, and it's worth asking asking the question. And I haven't actually got the words here or the person, but there's several comments here saying that this is the best Zoom presentation I've ever seen. So congratulations to Michael. And I think really, I mean, the questions keep coming. I could keep you here all night, but it wouldn't be fair on you, Michael. But, you know, on behalf of the company, I must thank you and congratulate you for what's been a wonderful, informative, interesting, interactive presentation. It's been very thought-provoking. It's disappointing that we're not in a lecture theatre so you could hear the applause, and I'm not even sure, I haven't got a thumbs up icon, but maybe people can attempt to give some sort of hand raise or something as recognition. But trust me, people think it's been fantastic. Well done.
My panel has now lit up with raised hands, so there are thumbs up all around.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, so well done. And I mean, I think, you know, again, on behalf of the company, we very much look forward to being able to welcome our audience to these lectures, the Cobham and Tim's lecture. Hopefully next time we'll be able to do it in the comfort of the RAF club, where we have our companionship, our social thing, and enjoy a drink, and that's some wonderful social occasion. But finally, on behalf of all the company, thank you, Michael. And thank you everybody else for joining, and good night.
And on that final word, I will turn off and end the webinar in a minute. Again, it will be a recording will be available. I will send the link to all the email addresses I have. We will put it on our website as well to get the link, and we will hopefully, in due course, put it on YouTube. So you will be able to see this again. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Michael. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Good night all.